Imagine a person who has been blind since birth. To navigate the world, their hearing has evolved, becoming almost superhuman. They can sense the shape of a room from the echo of a footstep, painting a detailed map of their surroundings using only sound. They've developed an extraordinary skill, a new way of seeing. Then, a miracle of modern medicine. A surgery restores their vision. You would expect this to be a moment of pure triumph, a simple addition of a new, powerful sense. But that's not what happens. The moment their eyes open, a silent, brutal war begins inside their brain. The new, overwhelming flood of visual data starts to attack the old, refined system. And that superhuman echolocation, it begins to fade, to vanish. This isn't just a medical curiosity. This war between the senses, this idea that one sense must become dominant by suppressing the others, isn't the exception. It's the rule. And it's the key to understanding how your brain is building your reality right now.
Well, yeah, that's a really powerful way to put it. And it's a stunning real-world demonstration of, well, what's going on inside your head constantly, what that patient experienced. That's the raw physical reality of the brain, basically choosing which input to prioritize. It's dynamic, it's competitive, it's this process, perceptual dominance that's shaping our whole subjective reality. It's deciding where the processing power goes, based on what's necessary, what's reliable.
Okay, yeah, let's really get into this then, because what we're seeing is that this resource management, this perceptual dominance, it's incredibly systematic. It's not random.
No, not at all.
And it doesn't just shape how you sense the world, but how you actually think about it. It seems to give rise to these really specific, measurable cognitive biases, things that affect everything from just, deciding what you see to how you analyze complex data maybe in your job.
That's exactly where we're headed today. We're going to take a deep dive into, I guess, 3 really interconnected areas. First, we'll map out this incredible neurological adaptability, what researchers call cross-modal plasticity, and see how the brain literally reclaims territory when one sense is deprived. Second, we'll look at the computational side effects of this hierarchy. We'll uncover these systematic temporal biases, the ways our timing is off when we make decisions.
Biases that kind of creep into the core process.
Yeah, right. And finally, we'll look at how researchers are now taking these fundamental rules, the brain's preferences, its built-in biases, and using them to design, well, radically better, more intuitive, and honestly more universally accessible technologies.
Okay, so this idea of a war for brain territory, it sounds dramatic, but cross-modal plasticity, or CMP, suggests it's functionally pretty accurate. What's the basic mechanism here? How does the brain manage this massive reorganization?
Well, the core mechanism really speaks to the brain's fundamental efficiency, its drive to not waste resources.
Yeah.
CMP is essentially what happens when deprivation, in one sense, let's say severe hearing loss or deafness, leads to the cortical areas usually handling that sense being, well, recruited by the senses that are still intact. Yeah, taken over. So the neurons, even entire pathways normally dedicated to hearing, might get repurposed by the visual system or maybe the somatosensory system, touch.
So the brain really does treat its processing areas like valuable real estate. If a tenant moves out, the neighbors just expand to fill the space.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
But it sounds so radical. I mean, it's not just turning a dial up or down. It's completely reassigning the function of that brain area.
It is radical.
No.
It goes both ways. It's reciprocal. Like you mentioned in the opening story, this is really well documented in vision research. If someone is blind from birth, their visual cortex, the occipital lobe back here, it gets functionally recruited for non-visual stuff.
Tough
like processing sound localization cues, figuring out where sounds are coming from, or even processing touch information like reading Braille or interpreting vibrations. Those highly specialized visual neurons start doing completely different jobs. It becomes a contested resource.
Okay, and you're saying we need to be clear, this is different from just like getting better at something within one sense.
Exactly. It's crucial to distinguish CMP from what's called intramodal plasticity. Intramodal is when changes happen within the same sensory system's cortical area because you use it more or less. Like if you practice juggling, your visual cortex might refine how it tracks motion. That's intramodal.
Right.
CMP is the big crossover event. It's the functional reassignment across different sensory systems.
Okay. Let's focus on hearing loss then. Because the evidence for CMP there seems particularly stark, especially looking at the developmental impact. What happens when a child's auditory system is deprived early on?
Yeah, with children, the timing is absolutely critical. There's this concept of a sensitive period, lasts roughly up to maybe 3.5 years old. During that time, the central auditory pathways are incredibly dependent on getting reliable sound input to develop properly.
And if they don't get it?
If that input is missing or just not good enough, those pathways just don't develop normally.
Yeah.
And critically, the brain seems to look at that underdeveloped auditory cortex and see it as, well, available real estate.
So if the sound system is weak or offline, the visual system basically sees an opportunity and rushes in.
That's essentially what the evidence suggests. There's observable, concrete proof of this visual takeover.
How do we see that?
Well, researchers did studies comparing kids with normal hearing to kids who received cochlear implants, or CIs. These CI kids often had periods of auditory deprivation before the implant. And when they were shown visual motion stimuli, things moving on a screen, the CI children showed really compelling signs of CMP. Specifically, they have larger cortical visual evoked potentials, CVEPs.
Okay, unpack CVP for us quickly. That's like a measurable electrical blip from the brain responding to the visual thing.
Exactly. It's a direct electrical signal. Larger amplitude just means a stronger, more intense brain response to that visual input.
And it wasn't just bigger, right? It was faster, too.
Right. They also showed earlier latencies, which means their brains were actually processing the visual information faster than the kids with normal hearing. Now, initially, you might think, oh, enhanced vision, that sounds good, like a kind of visual hypersensitivity, because those deprived brain areas are now pitching in for sight.
But the crucial part, the real giveaway, is where this enhanced visual processing was happening in the brain scans.
Precisely. It wasn't just lighting up the occipital lobe, the brain's usual visual HQ. The CI kids showed significant additional activation over in the right lateral temporal cortex,
Which is normally auditory territory.
prime auditory real estate. They were literally using parts of their brain designated for hearing to see moving objects and doing it more intensely and faster.
Wow. Okay, so on the surface, it looks like a kind of functional boost for vision, but I suspect it comes with a serious downside for hearing later on, especially after the implant.
A massive downside. It creates this really stark negative correlation functionally. The studies clearly showed that the children who ended up having poorer speech perception, particularly struggling to understand speech in noisy places like a classroom or a restaurant, were the same children who had that faster, earlier CVEP latency signature.
Oh, okay.
It strongly suggests that the difficulty they have processing complex, messy sounds is directly linked to how much their visual system took over during the deprivation period.
It makes sense. If your brain has basically rewired itself to rely heavily on visual cues, like lip reading, just to figure out what's being said, that must put an enormous cognitive load on you. You're using processing power that should be analyzing the sound just to figure out the basic signal.
You've got it. The brain is essentially trying to solve an auditory problem visually. And while that might be a helpful adaptation when you can't hear, it becomes maladaptive when you're trying to learn language through sound, especially complex language, after getting an implant.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. We kind of intuitively get vision taking over hearing territory. But does it go the other way? Or, maybe even stranger, does the sense of touch, the somatosensory system, get involved in this cortical land grab?
Absolutely. And this is where CMP gets really quite fascinating, almost counterintuitive. We see clear evidence for somatosensory CMP too, especially if you compare kids who got their implants early versus those implanted later, meaning they had longer periods of auditory deprivation.
What did they find in those lead-implanted kids?
They found significant and frankly abnormal functional connectivity. When these late-implanted children were presented with speech stimuli, just sounds, researchers saw activation in the postcentral gyrus.
Which is?
That's in the somatosensory cortex. It's the primary brain area dedicated to processing touch, temperature, bodily sensation.
Hold on. So listening to speech was activating their touch cortex. Their brain was somehow trying to process sound using the same neurons that feel things.
It appears so. It's a really bizarre mixing of modalities, showing just how desperate the brain is to utilize that dormant auditory territory.
That's wild. And does the recruitment go the other way? Does touch processing ever invade the auditory areas?
Yes, there's emerging evidence for that too. Studies are showing that the superior temporal gyrus, which is classic auditory processing territory, can be recruited for somatosensory tasks in CI kids.
How did they show that?
They applied a vibrotactile stimulus, basically a controlled vibration, to the child's index finger, and they observed activation lighting up in this auditory region. So, yeah, auditory areas were being used to process subtle feelings of vibration from the finger.
Okay, I think a common assumption might be that this kind of major brain rewiring, this plasticity, is really only reserved for profound, maybe catastrophic situations, like being blind since birth or profoundly deaf for years. But the research suggests it might be happening much earlier, and even in milder cases.
This is a really crucial point, especially for clinical awareness and early screening. CMP isn't limited to profound or very long-term deafness. Studies looking at adults found that even individuals with what's considered mild to moderate early-stage hearing loss.
People who might not even realize they have a problem.
Exactly. Many of them were completely unaware they had any measurable hearing loss. But brain scans showed they already exhibited recruitment of their temporal and even frontal cortices for visual processing.
Wow, so what does that imply?
It implies that even a subtle degradation in the quality or reliability of the auditory signal seems to be enough to trigger these cross-modal shifts. The brain is incredibly competitive for resources. If the auditory stream becomes even slightly less reliable than the visual stream, it looks like the visual system starts to encroach on that temporal lobe territory. It suggests the brain is almost hypervigilant about maintaining this resource balance.
Okay, so if CMP is this pervasive, this dynamic, can we actually use its signature? Can we look at where the brain has been repurposed and use that to predict how well someone might do after an intervention, like getting a cochlear implant?
This is really where the clinical application gets exciting. Researchers have found pretty compelling evidence that the type or pattern of this cross-modal shift can indeed predict CI outcomes. They often use a distinction between dorsal, sort of top, back, and ventral bottom front brain regions.
Okay.
And they found that patients who ended up with higher speech perception scores after getting their CI, the really good performers, tended to show higher levels of metabolic activity pre-implant in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC.
DLPSC, that's linked to executive functions, right? Like planning, working memory, cognitive control.
Exactly. So higher activity there suggests these individuals were already using active, effortful cognitive strategies. They were thinking hard, problem solving, consciously focusing to try and compensate for their hearing loss. It points towards an adaptive, sort of top-down, centralized compensation mechanism.
And what about the patients who didn't do as well, the average or poor performers?
They showed a different pattern. They tended to have higher levels of activity pre-implant in the ventral visual processing regions.
Ah, so that's the signature of the visual system taking over the auditory cortex directly.
Precisely. It seems to be the signature of that passive, bottom-up sensory cross-modal plasticity we talked about, vision automatically spilling over into the unused auditory space. And the data suggests that this reliance on direct sensory takeover by vision might actually be maladaptive. It might hinder the auditory system's ability to recover and properly process sound once the implant finally provides input.
And we can see this difference quite clearly when looking at individual cases, like in that P2-CVEP comparison study.
Yeah, that study illustrated it well. The good CI performers, when shown visual stimuli, had brain activation pretty much confined to the expected visual areas, like the occipital gyrus. Their sensory boundaries seemed relatively intact. But the average performers showed something different. In response to the same visual stimulus, they showed additional activation popping up in auditory regions, specifically the middle and superior temporal gyrus. Their brains were using areas meant for sound to process vision, and this directly correlated with poorer functional outcomes with their implant later on.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? The brain that kind of fights to keep its sensory pathways distinct, maybe using higher level thinking to compensate, seems better poised to benefit from restored input.
It does seem that way.
But is this maladaptive state permanent? Is the brain stuck once vision takes over? The story of that child with progressive single-sided deafness, SSD, seems to offer some hope.
Oh, that case study is truly remarkable. It's a fantastic demonstration of just how dynamic the cortex can be. This child had progressive hearing loss just in one ear. And before getting a CI for that ear, brain scans showed clear signs of cross-modal takeover specifically. Their left temporal cortex, the auditory area, was being recruited for somatosensory processing.
So sound processing was getting mixed up with touch processing.
Yes. But then they received the cochlear implant, which started providing a consistent, reliable auditory signal to that previously deprived ear. They followed up 27 months later.
And what happened?
The results were dramatic. They found a complete reversal of that somatosensory CMP. The touch system basically retreated entirely from the temporal cortex. And furthermore, they saw a partial reversal of visual CMP as well. It was as if the reliable auditory input effectively fought back and reclaimed its lost territory.
That's incredible. And did this neural reorganization translate into better real-world function?
Absolutely.
Yay.
That child showed significant improvements. Their speech perception in noisy environments and their ability to localize sounds became comparable to adults with normal hearing. It's really powerful evidence that this cross-modal plasticity isn't necessarily a fixed, permanent state. Timely, reliable sensory input can actually force the brain to reorganize itself back towards more optimal functional arrangement.
It really hammers home that the brain is constantly optimizing, constantly reorganizing itself based on the input it gets. And that reorganization, whether it's the sort of good adaptive cognitive effort or the bad maladaptive sensory takeover, that really sets the stage for our higher level thinking. If the basic sensory wiring is this competitive and, frankly, messy, it makes sense that our cognitive software, our decision making, might be a bit messy too.
That's a perfect bridge, actually. We're moving from the physical rewiring of the cortex to the, let's call them errors or biases in cognition. Think about when you, the listener, make a decision. It could be something simple, like, is that blurry shape a cat or a dog? Or something complex, like analyzing a spreadsheet. You're accumulating evidence over time.
And you probably assume or hope that you treat all that evidence fairly, giving equal weight to information you receive early on versus later on.
Right. That would be the optimal strategy, what's called flat weighting. An ideal Bayesian observer would do that. But the reality is, our decision-making process is deeply vulnerable to systematic temporal biases.
Yeah, we see these patterns where sometimes people overweight the early information. That's a primacy effect.
Or sometimes they overweight the very last piece of evidence they encounter, a recency effect.
And the weird thing was that different studies, even using similar tasks, were finding different biases, primacy, recency, sometimes optimal flat weighting. And the traditional models, like the basic drift diffusion model, couldn't really explain why.
Exactly. Those models could sort of explain primacy if you assumed people just stopped listening early, or recency if you assumed their memory was leaky, but they struggled to explain why the same person might switch from primacy to recency just based on subtle changes in how the information was presented, the stimulus statistics.
So researchers needed a new way of thinking about it, which led to this new hierarchical inference model. And the key idea seems to be splitting the process into two stages, right? Not just stimulus straight to decision.
Precisely. The brain doesn't just map raw input directly onto a final choice. It first infers some kind of intermediate sensory feature, and then uses that feature to make the final category decision. This lets us think about the task in terms of two different kinds of information quality.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's sensory information, or SI. This is basically about the quality or clarity of the raw input itself, moment by moment. How noisy or ambiguous is the stimulus right now?
Okay, the quality of the immediate evidence. And the second type.
That's category information, or CI. This is about how predictive that inferred sensory feature is of the final category label. Given what I think I just saw or heard, how certain can I be about the overall answer?
Right. So SI is about the moment-to-moment clarity, and CI is about how well that moment predicts the final outcome.
You got it. And these two dimensions, SI and CI, define a kind of two-dimensional task space. And where a task falls in this space seems to determine the temporal bias people show.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Give us an example of a task in the LSHC regime that's low sensory information, high category information. What does that look like, and what bias does it cause?
So LSHC is strongly linked to primacy effects. The classic example is the random dot motion task. You see a cloud of dots, some moving randomly, some coherently in one direction, and you have to judge the net direction.
Right.
Now, if the coherence is low, meaning only a small percentage of dots move together, then the sensory information, SI, in any single brief moment is quite weak, quite noisy. It's hard to tell the direction from just an instant. But if you happen to catch an early moment where, just by chance, the dots seem to move strongly in one direction, that single moment can give you high certainty about the overall category or answer, high CI.
Okay, so even though the evidence overall is noisy moment to moment, a lucky early glimpse can make you feel very confident about the final answer, and you sort of lock onto that early impression.
That's the dynamic in LSHC. You form a strong initial belief based on potentially weak but category-defining early evidence, and you tend to stick with it primacy.
Okay, now contrast that with the HSLC regime, high sensory information, low category information. What kind of task fits here, and what bias does it produce?
HSLC tends to result in flat weighting, maybe even recency effects. A good example here is something like the Poisson clicks task. You hear distinct clicks, maybe randomly presented to your left or right ear over a period, and you have to decide which side had more clicks overall.
Okay.
Now, The sensory information SI in each individual click is very high. A click is a click, it's clear, it's unambiguous.
Right, very clear signal, moment to moment.
But the relationship between that single clear click and the final overall category, which side had more, might be quite weak, especially early on. The clicks might be volatile, or the decision might depend on a very long sequence. So that single piece of high-quality information isn't strongly predictive of the final answer, low CI.
So in this case, the brain doesn't form that strong, sticky initial belief.
Exactly. Because the early evidence, even if clear, doesn't point strongly to the final category. The brain doesn't lock in early. It tends to weight new evidence more equally across time. Or sometimes, if memory fades a bit, it might even give more weight to the most recent clicks, hence flat or recency effects.
So the key mechanism driving the difference between primacy in LSHC and recency in HSLC seems to be this idea of confirmation bias, emerging from how the brain handles inference.
Yes, that's the core insight of this new model. The brain uses hierarchical inference. Higher brain areas form beliefs or hypotheses about the world, like the dots are moving left, and they send this beliefs back down via feedback connections to lower sensory areas.
Okay.
Now, an ideal, perfectly rational system would use that feedback carefully, making sure not to double count the evidence, not letting the belief overly influence the interpretation of new data.
But our brains aren't perfectly rational machines. They're built for efficiency, maybe taking shortcuts.
Precisely. Because the inference process in the brain is necessarily approximate, not mathematically perfect, it leads to a systematic shortcut, a confirmation bias. What happens is the brain tends to overweight new sensory information if that information agrees with the belief it already holds. The prior belief essentially primes the sensory system, making it more likely to interpret ambiguous incoming data in a way that confirms the belief.
Okay, so let's connect that back to the LSHC tasks, the ones with high category information.
Right. In those LSHC tasks, because the early evidence can quickly generate a strong belief about the category, it's definitely moving left. That strong belief gets fed back down vigorously to the sensory processing areas.
And that feedback loop then?
It creates a kind of positive feedback loop. Any subsequent sensory input, even if it's a bit ambiguous but happens to lean slightly towards left, gets amplified or overweighted because it confirms the strong existing belief. This causes the evidence accumulation process to accelerate towards the initially favored choice. And that acceleration, driven by the confirmation of an early belief, is what produces the strong primacy effect.
Wow, okay, so the model predicts that the bias isn't fixed but depends on this interplay between SI and CI. The critical test then was to see if you could take the same person and flip their bias just by changing the task structure, right?
Exactly. That was the crucial validation. Researchers designed clever visual discrimination tasks where they could carefully manipulate the stimulus statistics. They could shift the task for the same observer from being in the LSHC regime, which should cause primacy, to the HSLC regime, which should cause flat or recency, while keeping the overall difficulty of the task matched.
And did it work? Did people switch their bias?
They did. Robustly. As the task structure shifted from LSHC to HSLC, the observers reliably changed their temporal weighting strategy. They went from showing a clear primacy effect to showing flat weighting or even recency, just as the model predicted. It was strong evidence that it's the structure of the information, the balance of SI and CI, that dictates the cognitive bias, not just how hard the task is overall.
And this finding, this confirmation bias mechanism, also helps settle a debate about why primacy happens, right? It challenges the older integration to bound idea.
Yes, it provides pretty decisive evidence against the main alternative theory for primacy, which was called integration to bound, or ITB.
Remind us what ITB proposed.
ITB basically said that primacy happens because people accumulate evidence until it hits some internal threshold or bound, and then they just stop integrating. If you happen to hit that bound early in the trial, you effectively ignore all the later evidence, which naturally leads to overweighting the early stuff.
So ITB explains primacy as integration being cut short, truncated.
Right. But this new model, the confirmation bias model, explains primacy as the integration process speeding up, accelerating because of the positive feedback loop. Two very different underlying dynamics.
And the modeling showed which one was actually happening.
The modeling was key. They fitted an extended version of the ITB model to the behavioral data, allowing both the bound and the integration dynamics to vary. And they found that the change that best explained the shift from primacy to recency wasn't a change in the decision bound. The bound dollar stayed pretty high and stable across conditions.
So people weren't just stopping earlier in the primacy condition.
No. The crucial change was in the integration dynamics itself. This was captured by a parameter in the model often called alpha, which reflects how much the accumulation process accelerates or leaks over time.
And what did alpha do in the primacy condition?
In the primacy condition, the LSHC tasks, the model consistently inferred a negative value for alpha. In these kinds of accumulation models, a negative alpha doesn't mean leakiness. It signifies accelerating dynamics. It means that once the evidence starts pointing towards one choice, the process gains momentum, the integration slope gets steeper.
Which is the mathematical signature of
Confirmation bias. That accelerating dynamic is exactly what you'd expect if prior beliefs are positively reinforcing the interpretation of new evidence. So it strongly suggested that primacy arises from these accelerating dynamics driven by confirmation bias, not from simply hitting a bound early and stopping.
So it seems whether we're making a split-second judgment about what we see or maybe tackling a much bigger analytical problem, our brains are built on this hierarchical structure. They're constantly trying to predict, and they're systematically biased towards confirming their initial hunches, especially if the way the information comes in encourages that early certainty.
Right. And understanding these really deep rules, both the physical adaptability like cross-modal plasticity and these computational quirks like confirmation bias, naturally leads us to ask, well, how can we design technology that actually works with the brain's nature, with its competitiveness and its flexibility, rather than fighting against it?
Yeah, how do we leverage this? And the answer seems to lie in this fascinating field of sensory substitution devices, or SSDs.
Exactly. SSDs are basically techniques or devices designed to represent information that you'd normally get through one sense, say, vision, using an alternative sensory channel like hearing or touch.
Converting sight to sound or sight to vibration, things like that.
Yeah. And the whole idea relies on this concept of the metamodal brain. It's the theory that a lot of the sophisticated cognitive processing of the brain does things like figuring out where objects are in space, identifying what they are, directing attention might be organized in a more abstract way, kind of independent of which sense originally brought the information in.
So, the brain circuits for understanding where something is might be able to use input from the ears or the skin, not just the eyes, almost like we saw with CMP, where auditory cortex started processing touch.
Precisely. If you can feed the brain information through a different but reliable channel, the underlying cognitive machinery, the systems for spatial awareness, for object recognition, can often still process it effectively, because those systems seem to be organized by the function they perform, not strictly by the sense they serve.
And understanding this metamodal idea leads to a really important shift in how we should think about designing technology, especially for people with impairments.
It really does. The argument is that we should move away from focusing solely on creating highly specialized, often expensive, assistive devices that are only for, say, people with visual impairments or hearing loss.
Devices which, maybe sadly, sometimes have high abandonment rates because they're difficult to learn or cumbersome.
Right, and shift towards thinking about multisensory inclusive design.
Inclusive design, meaning?
Meaning, we aim to create cross-modal displays and interfaces that can actually benefit all users, regardless of whether they have an impairment or not. The idea is to leverage those shared metamodal perceptual and cognitive capabilities. If you design an interface that works really well using sound or touch for someone who can't see, chances are that same interface might also be beneficial for a sighted person in certain situations, maybe by reducing their visual cognitive load.
Okay, let's look at some concrete examples of SSDs. How do they actually do these mappings? Let's start with visual to auditory, turning sight into sound.
A classic example is a device called the Vias. It uses a camera, often head-mounted, and translates the visual scene into sonifications, basically, complex soundscapes. The mapping relies on trying to find intuitive links.
Like what?
Like mapping the vertical position of something in the visual field to auditory pitch. So higher objects translate to higher pitched sounds. And at the same time, maybe mapping the brightness of objects to the loudness of the sound. So bright spots sound louder. Users learn, with practice, to interpret these patterns of pitch and loudness to perceive spatial layouts, shapes, and light.
Okay, that sounds like it would take some learning. What about visual to tactile mappings, turning sight into touch? Do those feel more direct?
Often they do, yeah, because they can use more direct sort of analogical representations on the body. For example, some systems use an array of small vibrating pins, maybe worn on the back, or even an electrotactile grid placed on the tongue, exploiting the tongue's high sensitivity.
The BrainPort device uses the tongue, right?
That's the famous one. It delivers patterns of electrical stimulation to the tongue that correspond to the output of a camera. The idea is to convey shapes, like the outline of a door or a cup, directly onto the skin or tongue surface.
And can touch be used for things like distance information, too?
Yes, quite effectively. Devices like the iCane or the UltraCane, which are often handheld mobility aids, use a simple, robust mapping. They translate distance to an object into vibration intensity.
So closer objects vibrate more strongly.
Exactly. As you point the device and an object gets closer, the vibration in your hand gets stronger. If it's further away, the vibration is weaker. This works well because it taps into a very intuitive, almost primal pairing our brains understand. Greater intensity often means greater proximity or urgency.
And it seems like the success of these mappings, whether sound or touch, really hinges on finding these non-arbitrary connections, these cross-modal correspondences that our brains already seem to possess.
That's absolutely fundamental. These correspondences are the sort of natural, intuitive links our brains seem to make between features from different senses. Like, experiments show people consistently link rising pitch with upward movement, or maybe certain musical instrument sounds with specific colors, or louder sounds with brighter lights. These pairings seem to exist across cultures.
So, designing an SSD that uses, say, rising pitch for rising elevation feels natural because the brain already has a weak link there.
Precisely. If the technology aligns with these pre-existing non-arbitrary pairings, the substitution feels more intuitive, easier to learn, less like translating a completely foreign language.
Okay, thinking about the future then, especially in human-computer interaction, or HCI, designers using multiple senses need to be careful about how they combine them. There's an important distinction you mentioned between combination and integration.
Yes, this is a really practical point for designers. The goal should generally be multisensory combination, not the much harder goal of multisensory integration.
Why is integration so much harder? What does it entail?
True multisensory integration means presenting cues across different senses that are so perfectly aligned in space and time that your brain fuses them together, perceiving them as arising from a single, unified event in the world. Think about seeing and hearing a ball bounce at the exact same instant your brain integrates those into one event. Achieving that perfect spatial and temporal alignment artificially, with technology, is incredibly difficult. Slight timing errors or spatial mismatches can make the experience feel disjointed or even confusing rather than helpful.
So instead of striving for that perfect, seamless fusion, which is hard, designers should aim for combination.
Combination is the more pragmatic and often more effective approach. It just means providing complementary or redundant information through different sensory channels, simply to make the information easier to perceive or to reduce the cognitive load on any one sense.
Like having a warning signal that's both a flashing light and an audible alarm.
Exactly. You're providing the same essential information in multiple ways. The complementary nature ensures the user gets the message with less mental effort, regardless of, say, the background noise level, or if they happen to be looking away at that moment. It enhances robustness.
Let's bring this home with that navigation app example. How does designing for combination lead to an inclusive design that benefits everyone?
Okay, think about a standard GPS navigation app on your phone. An inclusively designed version might allow the user to easily switch or combine output modes. So, you could choose to receive directional cues as the usual voice commands, or perhaps as distinct vibration patterns delivered through a smartwatch or a band.
Okay, so the benefit for a visually impaired user is obvious. They get crucial navigation info non-visually.
Right, immediate access. But think about the sighted user walking through a busy city.
They probably don't want to be staring down at their phone screen constantly. It's distracting, maybe even unsafe.
Exactly. So if they can choose to receive those turn-by-turn directions as subtle vibrations on their wrist, they can keep their head up, be aware of their surroundings, cross streets more safely, maybe even enjoy the walk more. They're getting the same navigation information, but via a complementary, less demanding channel.
So the design choice made to accommodate the visually impaired user, adding a tactile output mode, ends up creating a better, safer, more pleasant experience for the sighted user too.
That's the core idea of inclusive design in this context. By understanding the brain's flexible, competitive, and metamodal nature, and by designing for multisensory combination, technologies built to accommodate the widest range of sensory abilities often end up enhancing the experience for absolutely everyone. #tag V, outro.
Well, this has been a really fascinating journey through how our brains manage the constant influx of sensory information. This deep dive, I think, has really shown that the reality we perceive is constructed based on these incredibly flexible, competitive, and systematically biased principles.
Yeah.
We started right down at the neural level, mapping that physical battlefield of the brain. We saw the profound adaptability of cross-modal plasticity, how sensory deprivation can cause whole cortical areas like the auditory cortex to be literally repurposed for sight or touch.
And crucially, we saw how the way it gets repurposed, whether it's that passive visual takeover versus more active cognitive compensation, can actually predict how well someone might recover function later on.
Then we moved up a level to the computational rules, the software running on that hardware. We uncovered that deeply ingrained confirmation bias, showing how it systematically shapes the way we weigh evidence over time, even in very basic perceptual judgments.
And we saw evidence that this bias seems to arise not because our integration process simply fails or stops, but because the brain is doing this efficient, approximate, hierarchical inference, which naturally leads it to overweight evidence that confirms its current best guess, especially when the information structure allows for strong early beliefs.
Right, that LSHC versus HSLC distinction. And finally, we looked at how understanding these fundamental rules, the fact that the brain is metamodal, constantly prioritizing, constantly reorganizing, is now guiding the development of new technologies. We're seeing a shift away from just specialized assistive devices towards this idea of multisensory inclusive design.
Design that uses combination rather than integration, leveraging multiple senses in ways that can reduce cognitive load and enhance usability for absolutely everyone, regardless of their sensory abilities.
So if there's one big takeaway from all this,
I think it's that the brain isn't just a passive receiver of information from the outside world. It's fundamentally a predictive hierarchical machine. It's constantly making bets, prioritizing certain inputs, both external sensory data and internal beliefs or predictions over others, all in an effort to construct a coherent, stable, workable version of reality.
and that reality isn't fixed. It's dynamic, it's demonstrably prone to these measurable biases we discussed, and it's constantly adjusting and reorganizing itself based on everything the world and now, increasingly, the technology we use throws at it.